I want to begin this presentation, though, by talking about something that at one point in my life I was quite passionate about, which is how you should store coffee beans. I used to work in a place that sold very good coffee. I worked for Campos Coffee back in the bad old days. And the fact is that there is a right way to store it. You put it in a cupboard in a sealed container. If you freeze it, it tastes terrible when you use it. If you put it in the fridge, it soaks up all the smells of the fridge. Okay, so there is a right way to do it, and I would explain this. And to my constant irritation, people would ignore me, and they would insist that their way of doing it was better. Fools. Now, who cares about coffee, really? Zahn, who cares about coffee, okay? I mention this, though, because what's true of storing coffee beans is also true of many other activities in our lives. There are right and wrong ways to do things. Think about things like cooking or learning to play a musical instrument. There are right and wrong ways to boil an egg or make an omelette. There are better and worse ways to hold a violin or position your lips on the mouth of a saxophone, on the mouthpiece of a saxophone, right? There are right and wrong ways to mould a pot, operate a chainsaw, and use Microsoft Excel. Some ways of using these things work, and some don't. And in the case of the chainsaw, they can kill you. Now, the same is true for more complicated activities beyond these kinds of kind of limited practical skills. Here's where things, I think, get interesting. Although there is, and there's going to be debate about what they are, there seem to be better and worse ways to do things like manage a team in a workplace, communicate with colleagues, run an emergency department, and structure a business. Of course, there's flexibility, there's room for diversity, yet there do seem to be some things we can say about each of these, about what's going to work and what isn't. In each case, there are some things you just have to do and some things that are very foolish to do or not do. We know, for example, that it's foolish for a team leader to obviously show partiality towards one team member. We know that honesty is generally a good policy in running a business. That's why it became a proverb. And we know that it's a bad idea for a boss to have a sexual relationship with an employee. Well, things get even more interesting if we think about other kinds of activities. Are there, say, right and wrong ways to parent small children, to look after teenagers, to respond to traumatic experiences, to arrange your diet, to spend your money, to be a partner in a marriage, or to care for an elderly relative? Now, that list probably made you nervous. Well, it makes me nervous. The idea that there's right and wrong ways to do those things. But let's not just dismiss it because it makes us nervous. Actually, it seems like the answer is definitely yes. There are right and wrong ways to do many of these things. There are ways that work and ways that don't. We might not know all of what they are, but we do know some things. We know, for example, that it's a mistake not to try to talk about and get help with traumatic experiences at some point. We know, for example, that it's a mistake to give small children lots of sugar, but that it's a good idea to read books to them. It's not rocket science at that level. Well, the reason these examples make us nervous is that with them there is a lot at stake. Whether or not you are storing your coffee beans right does not in the end matter at all. But whether or not you're dealing with traumatic experiences well, or conducting your marriage well, that's a big deal. It's a big deal because these activities are the substance of our lives. They are the big pieces of the puzzles that are our lives. And so they matter because we want those puzzles to turn out well. We want them to end up looking right. We want our lives to turn out well, and so it matters to us that, especially in the big things, we go the right way rather than the wrong way. That's why, in connection with these things, we often start to use the language of wisdom. If we thought about looking after teenagers, for example, or caring for an elderly person or leading a work team, it might make sense to talk about wisdom. Imagine somebody who really had a grip on how to do things like this, how to avoid mistakes, what to keep hold of, and what you can let go of. We might describe a person like that as wise. Wisdom seems to fit as a name here. We speak of wisdom, it seems, when what we have in mind is a kind of practical knowledge of how to do well things that are important, the things that matter in life. Well, the opposite of wisdom is folly, foolishness. And we use the language of folly, I think, more widely, because we use it when what we have in mind is mistakes with serious consequences. Remember at the beginning I said that someone who ignored my good advice about coffee storage, I said they were a fool, right? That was a joke. It was a joke, just so you know. It was a joke because the consequences are unimportant. Nice. But we wouldn't be joking if we described as foolish somebody who was using a chainsaw one-handed while holding the thing they were cutting with the other hand. That is foolish because the consequences are severe. Now notice one more thing about this train of thought, this weird journey I'm taking you on at the beginning, okay? Which is that all of this is very relevant to our working lives. It's relevant in a range of ways. Let me mention just two or three. First, for most of us, probably all of us actually, what we do for work, whether paid or unpaid, involves practical skills, like the ones we've been talking about. Jobs typically involve learning how to do certain things, often things that university, if you went there, didn't prepare you for. I'm sure I'm not the only one who had that typical experience of getting a job after uni and realising that you didn't know how to do it. You learnt lots of stuff and it was all completely useless in what you actually had to do, which was these particular skills that you had to learn. There's lots of examples. Treating somebody in hospital is not just a matter of a doctor's theoretical knowledge of disease, it's also a matter of a whole set of practical competencies, like putting in a cannula. You don't mostly want the doctor to do that. You get the nurse to do that because they actually can do it. Okay, so that's the first point. Secondly, the big picture of our work can often be understood in the terms we've been speaking of. This is going to get a bit abstract, don't worry, we'll come back to it. A form of work, like a kind of work, like medicine or garbage collection, it tends to be related to knowledge of how to do something that's useful for human life. I'm not trying to be too complicated here. The work of architecture and building exists because it's possible to know how to build houses well. The work of medicine exists because it's possible to know how to treat people with different conditions well. The work of farming exists because it's possible to know how to get different kinds of yield from land. Furthermore, each of those things that we've learned to do, they really matter, which is why we can speak of competence in these forms of work as wisdom. We might talk about a wise farmer or a wise doctor. Most of us will be able to think, actually, of the bigger picture of our work in terms like these. If we were pressed, if the alien asked us, we might be able to talk about, okay, well, what is my work about in the big picture? Well, it's about we're really aiming to do this kind of thing, and that's important because it helps people. Okay, and finally, very often our working lives are one of the big pieces of the puzzle that I mentioned before. How we go in our work, whether we succeed or fail, is one of the things that tends to matter to us quite a lot. So that making mistakes in our work or making big mistakes about our career is a big deal. We can quite naturally use the language of wisdom and folly to describe our choices in relation to work, the paths we have decided to go down. This is why work is very often, for many of us, a source of real anxiety. Okay, I hope you're still with me. That is a kind of long, meandering introduction that will raise more questions than I'll attempt to answer this evening. I don't expect you to agree with all of it, don't worry about that. We've done that little exploration though, because I think it can help us to profit from some things in the Bible that we otherwise tend to overlook. What I want to do now is to show you how the Book of Proverbs can give us a way of thinking about this whole aspect of our lives theologically, that is, in relation to God and to faith. Why is that worth doing? It's worth doing so that we don't compartmentalise our lives, so that we don't have our work life that's just disconnected from our faith. We need to find ways to join these things up, and I think some of this stuff from Proverbs can help. Maybe. We'll see how we go. Okay, so the Book of Proverbs. The Book of Proverbs is a remarkable and varied book. It's full of interesting ideas and things to say. It's a compilation of a range of writings dating back to a time in Israel's history when wisdom was especially interesting and debated and discussed, and various sages appeared and so on. In the form we have it, though, the Book of Proverbs is not just a collection of different traditions. It's one book. It's been brought together as a united whole that, if you read it like that, you see has a more or less coherent vision of reality and human life, and one that is really interesting, I think. Right at the centre of this coherent vision lies an affirmation that we find elsewhere in the Bible. The affirmation is that God made the world by wisdom. God made the world b'chokhmah in the Hebrew. Look with me at chapter 3, verses 19 to 20. By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding he set the heavens in place. By his knowledge the deeps were divided and the clouds let drop the dew. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean that God made the world by wisdom? Well, there's a helpful clue a little later in Proverbs. In chapter 24, this is what we read. By wisdom a house is built. By understanding it is established. By knowledge its rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Now, what's interesting here is that there is an exact parallel. You might have spotted it on the way through. In chapter 3, in the threefold sequence of wisdom, understanding, knowledge. We've now reached the limit of my PowerPoint skills, that kind of paralleling. But that's really something, isn't it, actually? Okay, how does that parallel help us? It helps us by connecting God's action in creation to our practical actions in the present, our practical wisdom in the present. I say practical because each of these terms, it's actually a little obscured in the English, but if you look at the other places those terms are used, they're often used of skills. And understanding. Knowledge is just knowledge, but understanding could be translated skill or competency. But also, more importantly, the analogy is with building a house. Now, it is important to say, what we're saying is that there is an analogy between the wisdom involved in building a house and the wisdom by which God made the earth. They're not exactly the same. God's action is always different to ours, but there is an analogy. The house building involved here is also not just the construction of a house. Nor is the wisdom involved just the wisdom of like an architect who imagines in their mind's eye this perfect construction that's then executed by the builders. Actually, that's not really what happens in architecture either. But the wisdom involved here is the actual practical competency in executing this task, in building a home, furnishing it, making it good to live in. And by analogy, when Proverbs says that the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, what it is saying is that God made the world well. He didn't just come up with a perfect idea and do it. He actually acted well. He acted prudently to achieve something good. He effected this action skillfully. In the 8th chapter of the book, we get a longer version of this story. And there, the voice of wisdom, the voice of the wisdom by which God created the earth, is personified. And we hear this wisdom speak for itself, or rather we hear this wisdom speak for herself. Because wisdom appears here, as everywhere in Proverbs, as a woman. This is how the chapter begins. Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? At the highest point along the way where the paths meet, she takes her stand. To you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all humankind. And wisdom then speaks and tells us about herself, how she is pure and reliable and the cause of all that is good in the world. And then in verse 22, which we start here, she starts to explain why this is. She gives us the backstory of the amazing position she has. Here it is. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works, before his deeds of old. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water. Before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills I was given birth. Before he made the world or its fields, or any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world and delighting in mankind. Wisdom was there at the beginning, Proverbs tells us, accompanying God's work of bringing the earth into being. She is, if I can put it this way, the joyful goodness that filled God's work of creation and that fills the earth, making it hospitable to human life. Okay, now, what we need to register here is that according to the book of Proverbs, at least according to the way Proverbs sees things, wisdom is not first and foremost something we have, a human capacity. Wisdom is not first and foremost something to be said about people, an attribute of certain wise people or wise actions. First and foremost, actually, wisdom is something to be said about God's creative work, and so something to be said about the world because of the way God has made it. That's actually why wisdom can speak in Proverbs, why wisdom calls to us. That image is used repeatedly in Proverbs, that wisdom calls out. Wisdom calls to us like another person, like a wise woman calling to us. Wisdom calls because wisdom is not simply something in us, but something in the world. Wisdom is primarily about how the world is good to live in, how it is full of ways of living that work, that lead to life. It's not primarily about how we are smart or prudent. Our words of wisdom and instructions in wisdom, they depend upon the reality of wisdom in the world, in creation, the wise paths that have been given to us to walk in. It's worth actually lingering over the metaphor that I just used, that metaphor of paths. This is a very important image in Proverbs. Language of paths and ways and tracks is everywhere. Happy are those who keep my ways. I instruct you in the way of wisdom. I lead you along straight paths. Wisdom leads to every good path. Her ways are pleasant ways. It's an important metaphor because it reflects the point I've just been attempting to make. The way wisdom is, in a sense, outside us, objective. It's something there in the world and not just in my brain or something. Wisdom is like a path lying before us. Being wise in Proverbs is about being on the right paths. It's about having a hold, if I can put it that way, on where wisdom lies. It's worth noting that it's actually not only Proverbs that uses this imagery of paths and ways. It's quite a natural way to speak. We speak of courses of action. We speak of being on the right track. At the beginning, when we talked about our work, we spoke of how we might talk about whether we've taken wise or foolish paths in our work life. Tracks, ways, paths, courses of action, it's a natural way of thinking, and Proverbs tells us that that is because that is really how the world is. God has made the world by wisdom, so that wisdom is really there for us. An opening and an opportunity lying before us, in a sense, calling out to us in welcome, extending a hand of hospitality. I think this way of seeing things can make a difference to the things we began by discussing. According to the Book of Proverbs, underneath the day-to-day realities we spoke of, the way that in all sorts of small and big things in life, there are good and bad ways to go, ways to do things that work and ways that don't, even up to some of the most important activities of our lives. The way we recognise that there are wise and foolish ways to go through our lives. Underneath these realities lies the reality that God made the world by wisdom. God made this world a certain way, with a certain shape, such that the world itself, creation itself, extends hospitality to certain kinds of action and not to others. And this means that when we speak of wisdom, when we recognise certain ways of acting as wise and others as foolish, and when we seek ways of doing things that work, we're not making all this up. This is very real. Wisdom is not a human invention. It is as real as the rocks and the water of the earth. All this helps us, I hope, understand our work too. Most basically, what we can say is that work is made possible by the good earth that God has made by wisdom, the world he has established to be lived in and lived in well. That's what makes it possible for us to work towards things that benefit others, for doctors to find evidence-based practices of care, for builders to know that there are right and wrong ways to pour concrete and reinforce steel, for speech therapists to discover effective ways to treat speech defects. It is why there are things to be learnt in all sorts of fields of knowledge, insights to be gained into how the world is and how it can be lived into. At one point in Wisdom's great speech in Proverbs 8, she tells us that, "By me kings reign and rulers decree what is just." That's a really important sentence for understanding work. Especially the work of government, to the great joy of the people I'm surrounded by in Canberra. The task of government, it tells us, is to act by wisdom. That is, to act in accordance with the reality of the world God has made and the ways in which it supports life. It'd be great if we did that a little more. The same is true, I think, of all kinds of work. The goal of our work is to work with wisdom, to discover, open up, and make use of the good ways of life that are there for us, to enjoy and benefit from the goodness of creation that God has made for us to share in. Okay, I'm going to take a pause there. That is not the end of my talk. You'll be saddened to know, but I'm going to take a pause because we need to put a break on all this enthusiasm. I'm going to tell you why that is in a sec, but just take a breather, wake yourself up if all that creation talk got to you a little bit and you're starting to fade after a long day of Excel spreadsheets. Take a deep breath. Okay. I said we need to put a break on all this enthusiasm. And the reason for that is simply that is just not what we do with our lives or our work. Look with me now at a passage from the very first chapter of Proverbs. It's the first speech that wisdom makes, and it is Pretty brutal. Out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. Here's the image again of wisdom calling. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. How long, here's her speech, how long will you who are simple love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? Repent at my rebuke. Then I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make known to you my teachings. But since you refuse to listen when I call, and no one pays attention when I stretch out my hand, since you disregard all my advice and do not accept my rebuke, I in turn will, listen to how harsh this is, I will laugh when disaster strikes you. I will mock when calamity overtakes you, like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you like a whirlwind, when distress and trouble overwhelm you. Then they will call to me, but I will not answer. They will look for me, but will not find me, since they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord. Since they would not accept my advice and spurned my rebuke, they will eat the fruit of their ways and be filled with the fruit of their schemes. As I said, this is the first speech of wisdom, and it is one of deep frustration. Frustration that people are so foolish that they ignore her call. They do not listen, but instead love their own stupid ways, complacently wandering off to self-destruction. I know how to do it, don't need your advice. Think of my frustration about the coffee beans, and then imagine it being felt by the universe about the way you're living your life. You fools, she says. And she seems to be talking about us. The Book of Proverbs does contain a profoundly positive way of understanding the world we live in, that it is made by God's wisdom, and it can, I think, give us a rich vision for our work, but it also contains a very confronting assessment of how, on the whole, we fare in relation to wisdom. We do not listen to wisdom's call, but turn aside from it and go our own ways. It's a harsh judgment. Now, when we hear something like this, certainly me, when I hear something like this, I don't tend to like it. I don't think you probably like hearing this. It's not a pleasant thought to imagine the deep structure of creation wringing its hands in frustration at the way you're living your life, is it? We try to find a way, therefore, to not see ourselves in it. Right? That's not talking about me. But can we really avoid this judgment? Perhaps in many ways we can. Right? We haven't all made terrible choices at every turn. I look out on you. Most of you are quite well dressed. You know, you're not doing too badly in life, it seems. We've got lots of things right. That's true, I think. That's true. You probably have got lots of things right. And yet, when we raised at the beginning the idea that there might be wise and foolish ways to, say, look after your parents, or be a parent, or a spouse, or spend your money, it made us nervous. That's because we also see that we don't always go the right way. We don't always follow the right paths. Actually, we tend to make a mess of things. We speak about learning from our mistakes, don't we? Learn from our mistakes, and that's fine. We can learn from our mistakes, but there are always also consequences for our mistakes. And there are some mistakes that are not worth the lessons we learn from them. In my experience, nowhere is this more obvious than in being a parent. You make mistakes, and they impact your children, and you don't get to go back and do it again. They may not be big mistakes, but they do matter. You know they do. Now, we live in a social and economic context that in many ways softens the consequences of the mistakes we make. Kids who fall in with a bad lot at school, maybe that was you, mostly find their way out again. In the world of Proverbs, like many other parts of the world today, if you fall in with a bad lot, mostly you die a violent death. But for many of us, there are lots of second chances. You make the wrong choices at school, you can probably still get into university. You make the wrong choices at university, you probably can do a second degree, or you can just try something different. You spend years ignoring the health of your body, there are medical solutions. And now this is all probably something to be very thankful for. Nobody's complaining about having second chances, that's great, but we should be careful, I think, before we imagine that it puts us in a different category altogether to these people in Proverbs 1. It might, on the other hand, just change the shape this whole story takes. Because all these solutions and second chances that we as a society have dedicated ourselves to providing, they have costs. They have to be paid for somehow by someone somewhere. And perhaps in many ways we end up merely deferring the consequences of our mistakes to later in our lives or to later generations. Perhaps we export them to people who are less fortunate than we are in other parts of the world. As I think about Bangladesh steadily disappearing underwater, and of the terrible famines devastating northern Africa, I find it hard not to feel that Australians are simply expecting other people to pay for our foolishness. Think about your own work. What kind of story does it tell about you or about us as a whole? We might like the idea that our work is about seeking to make use of the good paths that the good earth has provided for us. I hope you like that. But is that what we do? More often than not, it seems to me, our work is far from such a vision. Opportunities are wasted. Good possibilities are turned towards foolish ends. Resources are squandered. People are ignored and trodden on. The goal of profit takes over and obstructs the paths of wisdom. Instead of real opportunities, we go for imaginary ideals that end up not working or producing terrible unforeseen results. But what's worse is that even where there is competence, wisdom still eludes us so often. Real achievements so often fail to realise their promise because they're not connected up to the other parts that you'd need. Or later they come back to bite us. Real successes evaporate as new unexpected factors emerge or silly people come in and mess them up. People who are very good at their jobs, very competent, who we admire greatly as colleagues, can also be terrible at their lives. In fact, sometimes it seems like the cost of being good at your job is to be bad at your life. Wisdom is there for us, friends, because God made this world to be good for us. Wisdom calls to us, offering us paths that lead to life. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace, says Proverbs. But tragically, we just don't manage to take those ways consistently enough to make it work. Okay, well, I said it would be a bit grim, and it is a bit grim. But if we are willing to hear that bad news, then we will have a chance to hear the good news that comes after it. The good news, you will not be surprised to hear, is Jesus. But it's Jesus in a light that you perhaps haven't noticed him before. Did you notice when we read Proverbs 1 before, that the heart of wisdom's complaint is that they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord? Well, that is what made Jesus so different. Jesus was the one person who did not refuse to listen to wisdom's call. The one person who did not reject her advice but accepted it, took it on, and kept to her good paths. That's one way of understanding what made his life so special. He was the truly wise person. I think you can see it at every turn in the Gospels. Every time he speaks or doesn't speak. Every time he knows just what to say or to do. In the way he doesn't get angry until he does. And in the way he always sees what's important. Time and again, you see Jesus in these extraordinarily difficult situations, extraordinarily stressful social encounters where there's all this pressure on him. And with stunning grace, he manages to take the right steps. He's like someone dancing through a crowd of stumbling, awkward people, but never putting a foot out of place. There's this wonderful story by an Italian writer called Italo Calvino called The Adventure of a Skier. And it's this story about these Italian teenage boys who they just embody awkwardness. And they're in the lift queue. And they're falling over each other, they're losing their bindings, they're having to pick up their sticks. You can imagine it, right? If you've been skiing, they're just awkwardness, their shirts are kind of hanging out, they're falling over, they're swearing. And past them skis this, and they're in this long lift queue because it's just really busy. And then past them just skis up the hill this incredibly graceful Swiss girl in like leggings and on cross-country skis. And she just goes up the hill and they all just fall over looking at her. And then they follow her. It's a great story, but it's Jesus is almost like the Swiss girl, right? And it's funny, but it's also true. And later in the story, there's this incredible, this one of these boys just follows her because he's so mesmerised by her. And he gets to, and she said, if you come up the top of the mountain with me, you can see the hairs. There's hair. And he's like, she's opening up this world of grace and beauty. He was just there in the lift queue with kind of try and go as fast as he can down the hill. And she's got this kind of grace about her. And then eventually she skis off down the hill and he says, he watches her go and she's the only one he can see. And it's like it's like she'd found in the jumble and chaos of life, she'd found this secret line of where everything was just right. And you won't like to have me compare you to a kind of awkward Italian teenage snowboarder, but there are worse things. Jesus is incredibly gracious, and it's because he's the one who heard the call of wisdom and got it right. When he walks on water, when he walks out on the water and the disciples see him and they are totally awkward and stumbling, and Peter tries to go and then he starts drowning, and Jesus is on the water, I think we can hear the sound of wisdom filled with delight, rejoicing in God's whole world and delighting in humankind. And yet, Jesus was also not like the wisdom we meet in Proverbs. Yes, there are times when people drive him crazy, but he never washes his hands of us, like wisdom seems to in Proverbs. Jesus doesn't laugh at our calamity. He weeps over it. He doesn't call us fools. He takes pity on us, and like a good shepherd goes to find his lost sheep, even unto death. He died the death we deserved, the death that was right for fools. He died a death that belonged to the wayward, the complacent, those who ignored wisdom and wandered from the path. It was a death that did not belong to him. It did not fit him. But he made it his own for us. Even that he did gracefully. He, the wise one, became a fool for our sake. So friends, the most important lesson of Proverbs is not actually to teach us to be wise, but to point us to the one who, unlike us, was wise, so that we love him and believe in him. But of course, this also gives us work to do, and this is where we'll finish. Because Jesus doesn't save us from our folly so that we can keep wallowing in it. He calls us to learn wisdom's paths, again, even here in the midst of the mess that we've made. Be careful how you walk, writes the Apostle Paul in Ephesians. Not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. That's our task. And it's one that I want to suggest can give us back a vision for our work. We can't pretend we're back at square one, able to enjoy the good creation as if nothing bad has ever happened. Things have happened. People have done very silly things, evil things. We will therefore have to take great care. The days are evil. We cannot be naive about what the possibilities are. And most of all, we will need always to be ready to be gracious, to forgive, to bear with our own folly and that of others. And yet the world remains the good world God has made in which wisdom calls. That's the creation we live in. And Christ calls us to display his triumph, to show others something of what his kingdom means by seeking to work with wisdom, to discover and to make the most of the good paths that are there for us to take. That will be a real good and important part of what it means to follow Jesus today. I hope it gives you a genuinely inspiring vision for your work. I'm going to do this just because I can. I'm going back to Canberra, you won't notice. I know I've gone a bit over, but there you go. I want to finish with just a brief picture of what this can look like. It's the last passage of the Book of Proverbs. I won't read it all, but I just want to point you to it. What it is a picture of a woman who is meant to embody the wisdom about which Proverbs is concerned. It begins, a capable wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and she will have no lack of gain. It goes on and talks about the kinds of things she does. She's extraordinary. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She engages in kind of commerce, interacts with the merchants, brings things back. She prepares food and clothes for her household. Verse 16, she considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. It goes on, it's just this, actually this is an amazing poem. This, verses 10 to 31 are an acrostic poem in the Hebrew. Each one begins with a letter from A to Z of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's kind of the A to Z of wisdom, this portrait of this wise woman. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. And then it finishes, strength and dignity are her clothing. And she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed or happy. Her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates. This passage is in the book of Proverbs partly because it's mainly a book written to, originally, to young men. And it's meant to be a picture of the kind of woman they should be shooting for rather than the woman they probably are shooting for. Lots of Proverbs has young men in mind. It's why over and over and over again there are Proverbs that basically say, stop talking. Stop talking. Stop talking. Even fools are considered wise if they shut up. But this is in there not just because of that, though. It's also in there because I don't think they ever thought this was a real person. I think this is meant to encapsulate the kind of wisdom that Proverbs is seeking. This is the kind of wisdom that the earth holds out hospitality to. Now, when we think about it in our day, there'll be things to say that are quite different, both because there are now sewing machines, but more importantly, because Jesus needs to come into this picture now. But after all that, we can have this picture back, and it can give us a vision for our working lives, for work that is competently and diligently done, that makes use of the opportunities for good that the creation gives to us, wool, flax, fields that yield fruit, or whatever it is. And that is integrated into a whole life, at the centre of which is the fear of the Lord, the love that gives Jesus the first place he deserves.